Okay, let's talk about trash fish. Yeah, we're going to do a little trash talking here. We talked about how we can divide fish into predator species and trash or rough fish. And let's take a deeper dive into these guys. And if you remember, we call these rough fish or trash fish because they're not predators. They don't actively go out and bite a lure or attack a lure or suck in a worm or something like that. These fish do not feed that way. A long-nosed sucker is a prime example of this. They're aptly named. They literally vacuum the bottom of lakes and streams, looking for those little invertebrates. They'll suck in a small crayfish every now and then, but they're really looking for insects, things like that. When I was a kid up in the Allegheny Mountains during the summer, there was a bridge that crossed the Little Tinesta River. And a group of us kids would go out there on this bridge and would fish for sucker. And we would line the bridge. The bridge was an old iron trestle bridge, which they don't even have those anymore. And we would get in the ironworks and be hanging off the bridge and have a worm on a line with a split shot, and we would position the worm directly ahead of the upstream swimming sucker who was just working the bottom, kind of moving its head back and forth, literally vacuuming the bottom, and they would go right over top of our worm. We'd get so excited. He's coming, he's coming, he's coming. Hold still, not yet. He's there. And then the fish would just keep on going. It's like, what the? It wouldn't bite the worm. This is so weird. It didn't take us very long to figure out that whenever that sucker was going right over our worm, that's when we set the hook. Yeah, okay, we were snagging suckers. It's technically illegal. What do you do with a sucker? Well, you throw them back because they're really, really bony and they're not very good eating. And you catch them. You snag them and then you throw them back. We were kids. We were having fun. We were staying out of trouble. Mostly. Average length 15 to 25 inches. There is a technique for catching sucker during the spawn, and I know virtually nothing about it, but there's the whole category of these fish can be caught during spawning periods. There's other things you could be doing than messing around with suckers. Here's our thread fin shad that we have talked about down in Lake Monroe. These were illegally introduced into Monroe back during the in the 70s. Average size is 1 to 2 inches. They can grow to as large as 8 inches or so. Bass are the one of the primary predators of shad, and of course the striped bass or hybrid striped bass. These are plankton feeders. They do not eat invertebrates. They do not eat small minnows. They only eat plankton, which makes them so incredibly dangerous in a watershed. Because if they're eating all of the plankton, that's plankton that's not feeding, small minnows, the small fry of bass and things like that. So they can very quickly deplete a watershed. Hence, they are a trash fish, not a game fish. Now we get to carp. We've talked about carp before. Is this a game fish or is this a trash fish? When I was a kid, it was most definitely a trash fish. We would fish for them, but we would certainly not eat them. and they were not really part of the American lexicon whenever it comes to freshwater fishing. They have a really unique history. I don't think we've talked about this in class. Carp are originally from Asia. A lot of things are originally from Asia, and they were imported into Eastern Europe way back during the spice trade, the overland spice trade with China. If you remember the Silk Road overland through Mongolia and into China, these carp were brought in as a food source. In Asia, carp is like eating beef around here. Very, very popular. They were imported into Eastern Europe, and for centuries was a very stable food. In fact, I'll give you some links to some very unique carp videos. They've spread throughout Western Europe and were imported into the United States, I believe, around 1870, 1880s, someplace in there. After the Civil War, we had a tremendous influx of Western or Eastern Europeans into the U.S., and the Agriculture Department was afraid that we were not producing enough food for all these new immigrants, and they would find our food not very tasteful and would prefer their native food. So somebody came up with a bright idea of importing a bunch of carp from Eastern Europe, and they set up aquaculture farms throughout Pennsylvania, New York, primarily situated around Philadelphia and New York City, where most of these immigrants were settling. And it was a great success for 6 months, year, maybe 2 years. The new immigrants discovered beef, and that wasn't terribly plentiful in the home country. We had tons of beef. We're really good at growing beef, and they acquired a taste for hamburger and steak and so on and so forth. And who wants to eat a nasty old carp whenever you can sit down to a nice cow? So a lot of these aquaculture farms kind of fell by the wayside, and you add 1, 2, 3 real good floods, and all of these fish get washed out of the aquaculture lakes and into the main rivers, and it doesn't take very many decades for these fish to literally migrate throughout the entire United States. I don't know if there's any place that does not have carp. We consider them native because they've been here so long. We call them common carp. But technically they're a European carp. Technically they're a Asian carp. Now, I have up here grass carp. That is actually a different species, and a lot of people will throw the terms around, a grass carp and a common carp, but they're not the same thing. Grass carp are very specific. We'll get to them a little later. Ideal water temperature is 75 to 85 degrees. Average length 22 inches. I mean, this is one of the larger species that we have. You're not going to catch a 22-inch largemouth bass. Pike you certainly will, or muskie. Bluegill, no. I mean, walleye you can get up into 22, but this is average size, 22 inches. I mean, this is a good sized fish, and you can get you can get a 3-foot carp that weighs 30 pounds, and if you want to have some fun, latch onto one of these guys with a 4-weight fly rod. Yeah, we're going to town. we talked about how largemouth bass, you hook into one and he fights and he fights and he fights and he fights and it's like, okay, I'm going to do a jump, and he fights and he fights. Okay, I'm done. And you reel him in and you release him and he gives you a tail wag and he's back into the water. Not carp. You hook into a carp and it is like igniting a freight train. I mean, they are out of here heading for the next county, and they don't care if they're dragging you behind it or not. If you want to have some great fun, and if you can catch some carp whenever they're feeding in shallow water, these guys have an incredible lateral line. It's huge, running down both sides of the back. Their sides. They detect everything. I mean, whenever you close your car door in the parking lot, they hear that. I mean, they are very, very sensitive fish. They're rather difficult to just sneak up on. You'll find these guys along the shoreline tailing. And that's when their heads down into the bottom. Their tails are breaking the surface, and they're literally rooting the bottom of the lake or stream, looking for invertebrates. And you're walking along the shoreline. You can get so close. It might be 10 feet. It might be 5 feet. But at a certain point, these guys are going to explode, and they're going to throw water, and you'll just see this underwater missile, taking off through the water. My wife and I, when we were on our honeymoon way back when, we're up in the Allegheny Mountains on the Kinzua Reservoir, in a canoe, a Mad River Kevlar Explorer to be exact. My wife went canoeing on our honeymoon. How great is that? And we were out there in the shallow backwater, and the carp were just everywhere, and we were paddling through them. And in a canoe, of course, you're absolutely silent. And we would glide over top of one, and it would detect us. And it was like a small depth charge going off under the boat. I mean, it was just whoop, and they smack into the boat, and there'd be this huge, commotion and water flying over the place. And when one lights off like that, they all light off. And so we'd have carp just torpedoing one way and another. And some of them were coming straight at us, and it would just smack into the side of the boat. It was absolutely wild. Anyway, you can fish for carp. It's become an industry. It's actually quite big in fly fishing nowadays. There are carp fly fishing guides, if you can believe that. Yes, Michigan. Do a Google search. There's a guy up near Petoskey who guides half-day carp fishing on Traverse Bay, and just absolutely wild. There's flies that fly fishermen will tie specifically for carp. If you don't want to go that route, you can catch them in other ways. When I was a kid, I told you we used to go out on Friday nights with dough ball on one hook and a night crawler on the other hook of a Kentucky rig, and you'd usually catch the carp on the dough ball. We talked about the Wheaties recipe for carp bait. You can also use canned corn is an effective bait for carp, or you can adopt the Eastern or the European method. Oh yeah. We're not done here. There you go. TotalCarp.com. Carp fishing in Europe is a really big thing. I don't know. Maybe they're really bored. But it is huge over there. Number one, the carp are huge over there. There's websites, there's magazines, there's tackle specifically for carp. I've included several videos in the Unit 3 video list. Just cruise through there. It's absolutely wild. You can also. This was U.S. Carp Pro, a magazine that was in existence for a few years, about a dozen years ago in the U.S. It's the magazine itself, like so many of them, have ceased to exist, but the website is still alive and well. And do a quick Google search, and you will find organizations primarily in the South that have carp ins, where a whole bunch of people will show up at a lake and they'll fish for carp. They'll have either a barbecue or pitch-in dinners, a big social event. In fact, one of the advertisements is a bunch of people getting together, and we might fish for carp. So yeah, carp fishing is really big. It used to be something that just, honestly, poor people did, but nowadays it's huge. Carp has a bad rap in the U.S. We don't eat carp. Throughout Asia they eat carp. It's a staple food, but in the U.S. we have never developed the taste for it. And I think here, let me illustrate. I asked my uncle when I was a kid about fishing for carp and eating carp, and he said, "Oh yeah, we used to fish for carp. We used to eat them." And I asked how he cooked them. He says, "Well, that's real simple. We would go out and catch carp." He says, "You don't need one or two. We'll feed you." Build a fire in the backyard. He had a fire pit back there, and use some hardwoods, get a really good bed of coal, and then get either a cedar board or an oak board, and put the carp on and nail it right through the head, right onto the board. You don't even need to scale them or even gut them. Just nail the carp right onto the board, and then place the board on the hot coals and leave it. Half hour, 45 minutes. Come back, and everything will be nicely blackened. Take pull the board with the carp out of the fire. Take the carp off, throw it away, and eat the board. That's the Americans' approach to carp. They're just a waste fish, a rough fish, a trash fish. The Department of the Natural Resources in Illinois has done a really good job of trying to promote more carp consumption in the U.S., or specifically the state of Illinois. And on their website, I believe I have these videos in Unit 3, they show you how to clean carp. This is the thing that Americans always screw up. We don't clean these things well. Remember how sensitive I told you that carp are? How they can hear you coming from a mile away? That's because they have a huge lateral line. If you look at a bluegill, a trout, a largemouth bass, the lateral line's not very big. I mean, it's literally a kind of a line that runs down both sides of the fish. On a carp, that lateral line takes up about a third of the side of the fish. So let's imagine that you fillet a carp, and you've got this big slab of meat. Right during this, I really need to get some photos of this. Right down the middle of it is this dark reddish, brownish, nasty-ish looking area. We always called that the mud line. And you've got to cut that out. And in essence, whenever you get done cutting out the mud line, you only have 2/3 of the fillet left because it is so large. But the video does a really good job of showing how to do that. I mean, carp's been eaten, throughout Asia for literally millennium, and we just don't do it very well. Okay, here's a slide that kind of gives you a relative size of the various species. The muskie can eat anything on here. Poor little bluegill, don't stand a chance. They're a forage fish. Largemouth bass can eat a 10-inch, a 3-pound largemouth bass can eat a 10-inch largemouth bass. So you think of a fish eating half its body, and you can see how these various fish stack up. The salmon is probably a little undersized. They can easily become as large as most muskies on there. Catfish, if we're talking blue catfish, they can certainly become as large as a muskie. So this is relative and probably not all that terribly accurate. So anyway, that kind of wraps up our fish species. Remember, this is the classifications that we were using for class, where we break things down into saltwater species, freshwater species. The two saltwater species that we find in Indiana would be the salmon and the striped bass. The cold water species that we've talked about are the rainbow trout and the Chinook salmon. Everything else is warm water species, and we break all of these down into either game fish or rough fish. Sometimes we call them trash fish. So in the terms of carp, is that going to be a game fish or a rough fish? And probably a more modern definition between these two is, does the fish have economic value? 3 or 4 decades ago, catfish were considered a rough fish. Now they're food. I mean, we farm them aquaculture. We have catfish tournaments. I mean, catfish is really big. I think carp has kind of moved into the game fish category simply due to their economic impact. I mean, whenever you get a magazine, devoted to you've kind of arrived into the game fish category. Here's kind of a final look at fish species, various blocks that show the different categories. The true bass, if you remember, were things like the striped bass, white bass, yellow bass. The salmonoids were the Chinook salmon, the brown trout, rainbow trout, perch. We had the yellow perch and a walleye. And go back through the listings of these and put your various species matched up with the family that they belong to. So what exactly goes into the panfish? What exactly goes into the true bass? Here's an idea. We haven't got to aquatic invasive species yet. Here's an idea. If anybody wants to do a Venn diagram using the family groups, the panfish, true bass, catfish, so on and so forth, with the different species related in there, I will give you some extra credit. Honestly, this is something that we do in class, where I turn the entire classroom into a human Venn diagram. It's a lot of fun. There is no social distancing in that exercise. So if you want to do that on paper, scan it, email it to me. that would be great. I'll throw some extra credit your way. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up with the fish species and get into conservation and ethics in the next lecture.